Are we good? We on? Okay. Hello, everybody. We are back with the pupil waiting task force or whatever we're called. Sorry for our delay. We had technical difficulties. Just one point of clarification, after hearing all the testimony from the public hearing, we are modeling the entire package, not just a categorical aid. We're modeling with new weights. And yes, we have been in regular touch and working with the researchers that wrote the report from UVM and the other organizations. So those were two things that came up in the public hearing. And I just wanted to be clear about that we are modeling the entire package and trying to get that released as publicly as soon as we can. And we are continuing to work with the researchers. But this afternoon, we are going to hear from one of our analysts, Deb Brighton, who works with the Joint Fiscal Office. And she is going to walk through a proposal or a potential alternative that is based on the findings of the report that is a cost equity formula. So Deb, why don't you take it away?
Thank you. For the record, I'm Deb Brighton, consultant to the Joint Fiscal Office. And at the last meeting, probably all meetings, the task force was having a difficult time with two particular aspects of the weighting schemes. One was that it's difficult to turn the weights into dollars to get a sense of whether or not they seemed reasonable. For example, the weighting report recommended a weight of 3.14 for poverty students in one set of weights and 0.81 in another, roughly 1/4 of that amount in the alternative set of weights. But how can you make sense of that? And in any given set of weights, you were asking, does this weight mean, what does it mean in terms of additional dollars for poverty student, for example? And if you don't know what it means in terms of dollars per poverty student, how do you know whether it's reasonable or adequate to provide the programs or the interventions or the extra help? And so I think that was sort of one of the questions that came up a lot. And the answer to that question is that no matter which weighting scheme you choose, there is not a single answer to what a poverty student will bring in terms of aid. A single poverty weight would result in a poverty student in one district drawing a different amount from the education fund than a poverty student in another district. And that leads to the second question that you had, the second issue. And that is that the additional amount that would go from the ed fund as a result of the weight to a poverty student would be higher in high spending districts and lower in low spending districts. And I think this question came up this morning too. And that was a concern. And I think the task force was sort of talking about why that's happening and should it be happening. And at the end of the discussion, because I think there was a general feeling that that probably isn't what we want to do, that we would want it to be fair, Senator Perchlik posed a question, which was, is there a way to make a change upstream in the weight setting process so that the education fund would send the same amount per pupil to each district for each weight? And that was my homework assignment. And I found it pretty interesting. But so what I wanted to report today was basically a possible answer to that question, a possible way to go about it. And so before I get into that, I just wanted to say, I know you've heard this before, but that the weights that we're using to do these examples that Brad used this morning, that I'm using now, are not the ones that we're going to go with. So this is just sort of, yep, ignore the dollar amounts. But I did want to follow up with his example because we were running these two ways of looking at it parallel, just to see, as some of the speakers said during the hearing, They want to make sure that you understand the whole package and what really happens. And that's difficult to do right now, given that you're thinking, you've seen how all these weights interact. And I think it still leaves you with the impression that you, even though it's going to change dollars around, you don't exactly understand how and why. So at the end of Brad's chart, where he had the 5 sample districts and the right being the end of the chart, you ended up with a different amount of equalized pupils than you had in the beginning. And so I'd like to take that one step further, and that is to turn it into what you get from the Ed Fund. So let's say you have 2 districts that each ended up, they have the same weights, and they each ended up with 3 more equalized pupils than they started out with. And so they would both take their spending, their education spending, they divide by their new equalized pupils, they come up with a spending per pupil, and that would be exactly the amount that they would get per pupil from the Ed Fund. In other words, that's spending per pupil would be divided by the yield. It would give them a rate. And if they levied that rate, they would get from the Ed Fund exactly that education spending per pupil. So what that means is that those 3 new additional students that they got because of the weighting are bringing in exactly the same amount per pupil as their other pupils. So in one district, you have 3 new pupils and they spend $18,000 per pupil. That means that those 3 new students resulting from the weight bring in $18,000 each. Another district ends up with a spending per pupil of $13,000. That means that their 3 additional students have brought them $13,000 each for the same weights. So I hope that's clear that that's why we ended up with that issue, and why Senator Pertzik asked, could we go upstream somehow to try to deliver an equal amount of aid before it gets messed up with the calculating the tax rate. And so the study team itself used years of data to figure out the relationship between the various cost factors, the things that were weighting student outcomes and the costs. And from this, they developed weights. So the thought would be, if we could go upstream and start with those costs and not tangle them up with the weights, but if we decided that it costs $5,000 more to raise a certain category of student up to the desired outcome level, that would be the cost that we wanted to make sure that we covered. So we could do it directly rather than tangle it up in the weighting. So the weighting study did show some of the costs that were involved in creating the weights, but not a complete table of only those costs, so that we couldn't go directly to a table in the weighting study. So instead of being able to pull that out, and I should say we just got a memo saying that if that's what we wanted to do, they would have to recalculate. So it's limited to the categories that we're actually using. But for our exercise, to just follow up on my homework assignment, what we did was we took the set of weights that Brad was using in his example and backed into the average amount of dollar difference from each weight. And so then the idea would be, instead of using the weights, which are distributing a variety of dollar amounts, we would instead distribute the average amount for each weight to each district and see how that worked. And so we set up a table based on the average amounts, and that's your table 1 in the handout. And so what it's just showing you is the weight category and what I'm calling the cost per student. But
Deb, just 1 second. Is everybody seeing it? Cost equity formula example. Is that what it's called? Yeah.
yes, thank you.
Yep.
We have a lot of testimony in today, so you have to.
Okay.
It's scrolled down to the bottom.
Okay.
Does everyone have it up on their screen?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, great. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, you had a lot of handouts this morning, I guess. Right, so the table 1 is just showing you the costs that we backed into, which is for each weight category. It's giving you the additional cost that is being pulled out of the ed fund for a student in that category. Okay, so you can sort of see the same pattern that you saw with the weights. Like for middle school student, it's $2,597. For secondary school student, it's almost twice that, as the weights were almost twice that. For a poverty student, it's almost twice what the high school student would bring out because the weight was twice that, and so forth down the line. And so the idea would be that you go through the same process where you look at how many eligible students you had in each category, but instead of changing your equalized pupils, you would just directly send this amount of money from the ed fund. So this second table shows you the calculation that each district would go through. And I'm using Brad's District A. And I don't really want you to focus on the numbers, but I did have to go through the numbers to explain the mechanics. So in District A, there were 163 middle school students. And so you would multiply the 163 middle school students times the cost, the additional costs that they would get for being middle school students of $2,597. And you'd end up with $422,079. For secondary students, they had 236 in that district. You'd multiply that by 5,442, the cost per secondary student, and you'd end up with $1.3 million. For poverty, they had 474 students. You'd multiply, and this is poverty students, you'd multiply that by the 10,000 cost per student and end up with $4.7 million. And you do that for each category. You total it all up. And in this case, it totals to the $6,453,462. That amount would come directly from the ed fund to that district. So that essentially it's taking the same weights. The difference is really, it's assigning the average to every eligible student. Every poverty student would be getting the same amount every district. And the way we envisioned it and sort of thinking about this is that it would be sort of a package. It would be the cost equity formula payment and you could figure it out and you could understand it. And so after you got this, after a district got this payment from the education fund, then the rest of the process for calculating your rate would proceed as it does. You take your education spending, you subtract from it this cost equity formula payment and any other revenues that you have, and you take the remainder and divide by your pupil count. And in this case, it would be just your ADM count. And that's the amount that's divided by the yield to calculate your tax rate. So it would be pretty similar to the way that we're doing it now. It's obviously not free money. So after you've subtracted, everybody would get some of this formula aid.
Yeah, just hold on just 1 second. Oh, okay. Sorry, we had a question, but go ahead and you finish up and then we'll have a question from Representative Conlon.
Okay. So anyway, after you subtract this amount, your education spending will go down But there's less in the ed fund now to support education spending. So the yield will go down to, there's no free money coming in here. It's all coming out of the ed fund. So you will see basically in the end, when we compare where the tax rates ended up using this method versus using the weighted method, they're close, as you would imagine, because they've got sort of the same weighting. But the difference is that high spending districts, because they would get the average amount rather than the weighted or higher amount because they're high spenders, they wouldn't get as good a deal. In other words, their rate would be slightly higher this way than doing it through the pupil weighting. And the lower spending districts would get more from getting the average amount as opposed to related to their spending. So they would do better. Their rates would be slightly lower. And so I think naturally you would have to, if you did something like this, you would have to index it to something like a state and local government index or this change in the spending per pupil or some other index so that it could keep up with inflation and with reality. But I think some of the reasons that you might want to do this, well, the first is the reason that we even went through this homework assignment was the payment in this case for a poverty student or whatever would be the same in all districts, not higher in high spending districts. The second is that it would enable us to address student costs directly rather than tying them into tax capacity, which both complicates our understanding of it and distorts our ability to apply the right amount of aid. The third is that people could actually understand how the aid is being distributed. And the fourth is that people could ground truth the cost. You could use the studies costs as a starting point, but you could show these costs to people and refine them based on the expertise and the experience of educators and people who are actually trying to educate these students. So I just want to say to please ignore the amounts in this table. That is just an example, as I guess we've said a lot of times this earlier today, and it's just the concepts that that I wanted to share with you.
Okay, thank you, Deb. Let's go to some questions as we all absorb this information. So Representative Conlon.
Thanks. Hi, Deb. I just want to clarify, when you talk about the average, you're talking about average per pupil spending that we build off.
When I talk about the average, we actually ran the weighting study. No, I'm sorry. We actually ran the revisions to the weights. We ran the weights that Brad showed you this morning through every district. And then we back calculated to figure out how much aid each weight added. And then we averaged that. So in other words, the poverty weight was averaged for poverty students, and the high school weight was averaged for high school students. and it is using the actual, the model ran with the actual spending for 2020.
All right, thanks. And then that would then have to be pegged to some sort of inflator year to year. The average would.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, thanks.
There are other, Senator Perchlik.
Yeah, thanks, Deb, for doing this homework assignment. It is interesting to think about it, but I wanted to just, I guess, maybe confirm some of what I'm assuming or think I know, that the study, Dr. Colby's study, did start with a dollar amount, right? Like the weights were where they started. They had to come up with a dollar amount to figure out what the dollar amount was needed to have the results that they were looking for.
Yeah, That's my understanding. I think part of the issue is that the table that they showed us with the costs that then turned into the weights had other costs as well in them. So there wasn't a clean run with you figuring out the costs based on only, say, the 7 factors that they ended up using. So they would have to rerun it. But it is, using your request, it is upstream in this process, in the same process, using the same information.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was trying to get at, because as we heard again today in the public hearing, people want us to use the study. So I feel like we are using the study. We could do this and still be using the research that was done on what the actual cost was to get the outcomes that we want. I understand how you did it, and I understand how that the study doesn't really, that wasn't the goal of the study, just to do the number.
Yeah.
It was the weights, so it focuses on the weights. So I think more than attaching or pegging this to some kind of inflation over time, we'd also want to make sure it's pegged to that founding principle of that the dollar amount is having the outcome that we want. I mean, it might be the outcome today based on the study, but in 5 years, inflation helps a little bit, but we might want to also make sure it's correlating to what the outcomes are of the students.
Yeah, I think one thing, sorry, Deb, but that we talked about was, as Deb called it, ground truthing. And I actually revised that to say school truthing, and seeing what schools are actually needing to spend to bring students up to the same level of outcome. As we also heard in testimony, the same level of opportunity.
Right.
So we could, build in evaluation over time to see if the cost factors are what is actually needed in a real school setting.
Right. So I guess it wasn't really a question for Deb. I guess it was just talking out loud.
No, did you want to add anything to that, Deb?
No, I guess the other thing that the homework assignment made me think, though, was that we do want to build something into whatever it is to help us evaluate. And it just seems to me, whether you do weighting or whether you do it this way, it's helpful to figure out what the average amount that we're sending for each of these weights is, and whether that's realistic. And I think that you can't really, I don't know how you can evaluate the reasonableness of the weights unless you start turning them into dollars at some point.
Representative Beck, did you have a question or a comment?
Just a comment. Thank you, Deb, for putting this together and putting it together in a way that's really easy to understand. I'd like to echo Senator Pertz's comment that I appreciate that it is tied to the work of the UVM study. And I'd also really like to thank you for coming forward with this as a way to solve the equity problem that exists with weighting, to do this in a way that's a lot more equitable for all Vermont kids.
Senator Brock, did you have? Oh, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Representative Beck, what do you mean about the inequity in the weighting?
Well, just what Deb talked about, where the amount we're using weighting, the amount of tax capacity the district receives is a function of how much it spends. And so if a higher spending district is getting more tax capacity than a lower spending district, then that's more resources that are being channeled to a kid that suffers from poverty or a secondary student, doesn't matter what it is. But categorical aid eliminates that inequity. And I really appreciate that idea.
Senator Brock, did you have your hand up? I can't quite see you.
I didn't have my hand up, too busy thinking.
Oh, okay. I thought I sensed something, energy in that corner, so I wanted to make sure.
I mean, as I look at the numbers, that where I continue to be troubled is saying, okay, at the end of the day, if I would like to audit the accuracy of the numbers, and I looked at something like cost per student. And I'm struggling with, well, how would I do that? Because the cost per student, for example, for a student in poverty may be very different. And I don't know what the range of that difference would be from high to low across the universe of districts in Vermont. And so that's problem one. And maybe there's an answer to that I've missed somewhere along the line. The second is I want to know perhaps more precisely of what's in that number in the first place in terms of how it's calculated. So that's kind of my second question. And then an assumption, as I look at the chart, maybe I don't entirely understand the chart, is if I look at the number in poverty, and then I look at middle and secondary, I'm assuming that there are some number of people here who are elementary students who don't appear on the chart. Is that correct?
Right. So let's see if I can remember all your questions. Let's see. The first one is, where does this number come from? And in this case,
Average, and what's the range if it is?
Well, what I'm suggesting is that there not be a range, that this be, that you settle on one number if you go this way. So there's no range. Currently, there is a range, and it's the same range as the spending per pupil, average spending per pupil. In other words, we have district spending. Actually, Brad could tell you what the range is right now, but it's maybe $3,000 on either side of the average spending per pupil. And the average is around 16,000. So you would say that you would see that same kind of range using the weighting method. Or if you use this method, it would just be that one number. There'd be no range around each number.
Are you suggesting that maybe, for example, in poverty, something like a 30% difference? Potentially? You mentioned 3,000 and I'm looking at a 10,000 number. You know, am I misunderstanding?
In using weighting, the poverty student, yes, the poverty student could be, it would be less than that. So I'd say maybe, I'm guessing right now, but I'm saying like using weighting, the weight given to a poverty student could vary between $2,000 up or down from the number that I've shown as the average. If you don't use the weighting, if you just set one rate, which right here happens to be the average, then you wouldn't have any variation at all.
Well, my only question is, knowing what that potential range could be is a fundamental issue regarding whether or not
Yes.
you've achieved it, isn't it?
So I mean, I think I can explain it, but I think that's better if Deb or Brad or Mark explain it. Do you understand the question that Senator Brock is trying to ask? I mean, I think he's getting at, there is the range because of the weights. And how do we know the range is the correct range?
Well, how do we know that the
And-
range is not inequitable of and in itself?
It is.
It is. I think that's what led to this, is that the
Yeah.
range.
But how do we know we're making it better, I guess is a better way of phrasing the question.
Isn't the range ultimately based in per pupil spending?
Yes.
Yes, and so that's a decision that's made locally.
So the per pupil spending is based on what the local school district's budget, and then the taxpayers and the voters in each of the towns vote on. And so there is a range, and in our already on per pupil spending, and the weights, because they're applied to per pupil amount, create a range in amount of resources that could potentially go to a district if they use that extra tax
Well, I
capacity.
guess what I'm getting at is if you erase all of the issue about ranges and quotas and everything that we're doing and so on, and we say to ourselves, our object in all of this, the reason that we're doing this is to spend the correct amount of money for a particular individual kid who falls into a set of categories, poverty being one of them. And if the range in which that spending occurs in one district is materially different than that in another district, then the question is, have we accomplished what it is we intended to do? So that's why, to me, that range is an important thing for us to understand across districts.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the blunt answer to your question is no, then we haven't achieved what we want to achieve. And that is how our system exists now. And I think that it's how the system would exist if we implemented a weighting system and didn't account for the other distortions that we create in the system by magnified weights. I do have, your question brought up another question for me, which is if we design systems based on existing spending, we don't know if the existing spending is actually the right amount of spending to be designing the system on, because people in some districts, because people make spending decisions for all kinds of reasons, doing the very best they can in those circumstances. And so in a chronically underfunded system, to design a system that, we don't want to design a system that perpetuates a chronically underfunded system or a chronically overfunded system. And so I think that is also an important question in this. And we do have study way back in the archives from Larry Pikus that does get more at that question of what is what is an appropriate number, but that's not something we've been drawing on very much in these conversations. I don't know if that was too
I know we haven't been drawing on it.
spiritual
I agree with you there.
of an answer.
I guess, and well, the study is actually from 2016, so it's not actually much older than the report that we're looking at right now. It's only 2 years difference. But I think one of the things that Deb was saying in her explanation is the whole concept, like I was saying, of school truthing it or ground truthing it and seeing if it's the right number after a couple of years. Does it match with what school districts are experiencing on the ground for the resources they need for students? And it's much harder to do that with the weights because of the range and because it's much harder to get to the cost through the weights than it is through a cost equity type
Is it
of
the cost
formula.
or is it the spending, which are two different things?
Yes, you're right. Wait a second. I want to see if anybody who hasn't already asked a question has a question. Representative James. Go ahead.
It's not ready yet.
Okay, you're still thinking. Okay. Senator Hooker, do you have anything? You're set? Okay. So Senator Perchlik and then Representative Beck. I'm trying to go in the right order here.
Just in response to Senator Brock's point, that the averages that are just based on the spending of pupils, not on the spending for poverty students, we don't really know that number. So if we had that number, it would be interesting. So that's basically what we're taking, I think, from the UVM Rutgers study is what is the number to get the outcome? What is that dollar number? What's the spending we need to make for these different categories of students? And that's the number that we have. Basically what Ms. Brighton has presented is that number averaged, because we don't really have just one number. I mean, we could just do that one number, but it's hard to figure out what that number is.
Right. And did you want to add something, Deb? It
No.
seems like,
That-
no,
That's
okay,
exactly what, yeah.
okay. Representative Beck.
Yeah, just to add comment to Senator Brock's question. I look at it as the problem, it's the range, which is caused by weighting in our current funding system, which leads to an equity problem. So the way to fix the problem is to eliminate the range. And we do that by thoughtfully picking a number that is fixed for all districts. That's the way I look at it. A number, yeah. I mean, 10,017 is the one here for poverty, but I don't know if that's the right number, but.
Representative James, wait, did you want to say something, Deb? You're good,
That's right.
okay. I heard a noise, so Representative James, go ahead.
so I just want to make sure I'm up to speed here. So what I hear everybody saying is that both the, as we know, both the weights and whatever the cost factor amount would be, whatever we see hypotheticals here, but because because both of those in the study and Deb Brighton's example are based on current spending, and we really have no good way of knowing right now whether current spending is what we need to be spending. I think I hear you saying that really with the weights or this method, the only way to find out is to roll out one of them and then start some sort of rigorous assessment process so that we're currently checking in with districts to find out in the real world, is this the right amount? Did I understand that right?
Yeah, I think that's ultimately we would have to do. We do have a study from 2016 that is, what is it? The adequacy
Yeah.
study that sort of looked at whether or not we're spending an adequate amount of money on education in Vermont. And broadly speaking, that study found, yes, we are. Broadly speaking, I think there were some, obviously caveats to that. And the weighting study found that there were inequities in the way that we're distributing tax capacity to districts. But I think ultimately, whatever we end up in implementing, whether it's the weights or a cost equity formula or some kind of combination of the two, we would want to have build in some kind of evaluation to see if we've done it right. The other point I would make is that the weighting study is based, the outcome that the weighting study is based on is test scores.
Right.
And only English language, or English,
ELA and math.
ELA, thank you, and math only. So I think one other factor we could consider is a broader definition of outcomes and what other factors might we want to consider as outcomes. And it could be other measured factors, like graduation rates or other things like that we could measure as well in a evaluation. If we don't have, Representative Kornheiser.
I would just one more time, Deb, before you go, if you could explain how using the cost equity formula that you put together for us here saves us from the distortions that Senator Perchlik asked us about at our last meeting. So how does this, just sort of like a closing summary on how this formula sort of creates a more equitable system that saves us from some of those distortions? Sorry.
Okay, I think the distortions are due to that range that we've been talking about. And that's due to the range in the spending per pupil. So what this does is it sets $1 amount per pupil for each of the eligible pupils in the different categories. It doesn't allow that range that we have in current law that results from the different spending per pupil. So that it just means that a poverty student in any district would draw from the ed fund the same amount. It wouldn't depend on the district spending per pupil at all.
Okay, is that clear for everyone? So one of the, is the task force interested enough in seeing how this plays out to have it modeled? Deb and Brad and Mark have been working on sort of dual models of modeling the weights and modeling a cost equity formula and seeing how they would differ and what would be the pluses and minuses of either one of them. And that is dependent on the information that we get back from Professor Colby with the recalculation of the weights and the other things. And so they are meeting with Professor Colby on Monday to discuss these changes in the modeling with her. And I just want to make sure everyone's good with having these sort of dual options modeled out. Yeah, okay. So I think,
Just a question with regard to ELL. This is still keeping ELL as categorical spending, or can ELL be included in this kind of analysis?
I think we were thinking of keeping ELL the way it is, mainly because it has that sort of unique first person in gets much more, and then each student gets the $5,000. So it doesn't fold into this as easily.
Okay, but is there a way of figuring out, as you did with this, how much money is being spent per district on ELL, and then having, again, an average amount assigned to it, to the students?
Well, we could, I think we could fold it into the same package if that's what you wanted to do. Just sort of have a different equation.
yeah, go ahead.
But what I think is different about the two things is that the ELL package, as we've sort of been talking about it more recently, does do the same thing in terms of the per pupil costs that get sent to a district and is working backwards from the weights in the same way. It just starts with a lump sum to make sure that every capacity has enough to make sure every district has enough capacity. This has been a very long day for me.
It's just a two-step calculation. It's the same idea.
But it's still
With a
using,
baseline guarantee.
Yeah, that's.
it still backs into the number for the per pupil for ELL in the exact same way.
Senator Perchlik.
That last thing that you said, Representative Kornheiser, I didn't know that was the case, because my understanding from the ELL presentation last week was that it was chosen by what we kind of thought was the right number, not from the study by doing the weights and then doing an average of what the ELL weight would happen. And I thought that was basically because the way the study came up with the ELL is that the table shows a negative number for ELL instruction. So the study looked at some regional costs and basically came up with kind of what some regional schools use for ELL, and then figured that as a weight. But that the $5,000 per pupil in the proposal is not based on that weight figured out to the schools and then averaged.
It is not. What Deb and I worked on was trying to figure out what the amount was. And you're right, one of the weights in the study for ELL is negative. So we couldn't use that because it would be taking money or tax capacity away from the districts. The other, the weight in the column that the task force is sort of leaning toward, the per pupil amount cost equivalent was $2,900. And based on what we were seeing of what districts were actually budgeting and spending on ELL, that wasn't a sufficient amount to be able to bring the districts up that needed to spend more on ELL. So that's why we went with the 5,000 amount with the 25,000 base amount. So it is based on looking at what was the cost equivalent in the study and seeing that ground truth basically with what districts are budgeting and spending on ELL. So we could run it through as a, through this formula that Deb has done to see what happens there. But based on what was in the study and our understanding of what was in the study, it was a lower amount per pupil for ELL. And in comparing it to the actual amounts the districts were spending, it wasn't sufficient.
Right. It was informed by the study. And that makes sense because the study looking at regional, we're probably looking at larger ELL populations. And so the per pupil is going to be a lower amount. So, I mean, I think I like what you did, how you came up with that number, but I just want to be clear that it wasn't the same as the way.
It's not the same methodology, and we could certainly, check it with that methodology and see and add it in there as a possibility. But it was a different methodology based on what we were seeing districts spending on ELL. And that's one of the things that makes it easier to sort of ground truth it because it's an actual program, whereas there's not a program per se that says this is how much we spend on students in poverty. Because it's like kind of all over the map, you know, in terms of what the needs are, or this is what we're spending all over on, you know, being a rural school or whatever. So it's easier to track the costs in a budget and then in actuals on a program like ELL than it is for a small school or rural school or school in high poverty. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, Emily.
And I'm sorry, I was messy in my language. I just mean that we started by working backwards, and that was the beginning of that conversation, the same way that it starts from working backwards.
Okay, so we're gonna ask Deb and Brad and Mark to continue with their modeling and do this sort of parallel model so we can compare the two maybe next week, we'll see. And looking at Brad over there. Right now, unless there are other questions for Deb, we're gonna move to our final portion of the program for today. Are we good with moving on? Okay, so we have two people joining us from the Education Commission of the States. Thank you, Deb, very much for your work, and have a good weekend.
Thank you.
From the Education Commission of the States, you might recall that Professor Colby and her team used some information from a 50-state comparison that the Education Commission of the States did to compare how states fund schools in the different elements of a school funding system across the country. They have since updated that 50-state comparison and just released their new information earlier this month. And I've been in communications with them. And so they're here to share some testimony on the update to that report and to answer questions that we may have on it. So we have Joel Moore and Christopher Duncan with us. Are you there?
Hi, thank you. Thank you.
Hi,
Senator
guys.
Hall.
Thank you for joining us. And Joel, are you going to kick it off?
Sure, that'd be great.
Excellent. Just
thanks,
introduce
and-
yourself. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Senator Hardy and Representative Kornheiser for the invitation, and thanks to the task force for allowing Education Commission of the States to be here and share a bit about, as Senator Hardy mentioned, our updated 50-state comparison on K-12 and special education funding. My name is Joel Moore. I'm part of the state relations team here at Education Commission of the States, and I'm also ECS's liaison to Vermont. And I'm joined, as Senator mentioned, by the amazing Christopher Duncombe, our senior policy analyst for school finance. Chris and I have been two of your dedicated YouTube stream viewers for the last several months, so it's nice to be able to connect virtually on it. Before Chris begins, I do want to share very briefly about ECS. We were founded about 60 years ago as a national nonpartisan education policy center in all 50 state statutes through an interstate compact. We have the goal and purpose of helping education policymakers from around the country and across the preschool to workforce spectrum learn from one another. And so to do that, we work with governor's offices, departments of education, boards of education, higher education, and legislators and their staffs with the goal of helping you all share ideas, discuss solutions, and tackle your specific state challenges. Again, we're nonpartisan and non-advocacy. We'd like to tell states, we can't tell you what's right for you. You know your state and its unique challenges the best, but we can tell you what the 49 other states are doing and what that looks like for them. So ahead of this meeting and already shared with you are documents containing some of ECS's funding resources, including that updated 50-state comparison on K-12 and special education funding. There's also a glossary of education funding and two different policy reports detailing some different ways that states have responded to COVID-19. And then a second document contains a series of maps demonstrating the different ways that schools are funded across the country. I think Chris will probably refer to both of those during his comments. Those are, for anyone joining virtually, those are available in the supporting documents section of the task force's website. So with that, I'll let Chris take over. Chris?
Thank you, Joel, and thank you, Senator Hardy and members of the task force for having us here today. I know it's been a really long day for you all, and excited to be here. Been monitoring your work, and you really been diving in and taking a comprehensive look at your finance model. And you've already received, extensive modeling and reports, including the report that's been referenced numerous times today from Dr. Colby, Dr. Baker, and Dr. Atchison. And so I know that you are already fairly far along in the process here. But I am excited to be here today to introduce or reintroduce you to Education Commission of the States, share some of our recent research, and really invite your questions of any of the issues that you're still grappling with. So as Joel mentioned, a primary motive of the Education Commission of the States is to facilitate cross-state learning. And in K-12 finance, that can be really challenging because one, school finance systems are complex, and here in Vermont, you all know that because it's really complex here. And two is to try to create a common language. States will have their own finance vernacular that will make it really difficult to understand already complex systems. So that's why, as Joel mentioned, we have put together a finance glossary, which may not be the most exciting document to dig into, but we really think it's important to have a common language when we're talking about these issues. So I also want to note that, while what we do is to collect information, organize it, and repackage it in a way that you can engage with it, what we do not do is we do not have more expertise than you and your staff on K-12 finance in Vermont, or the circumstances and challenges that you're facing in your state. So that's why a dialogue is really helpful, so that we can identify what will be most useful for you. And one of the products that I'm here to discuss today is a 50-state comparison. And this is where, when staff such as myself, we dig into state legislative code, state budgets, administrative code, state agency presentations and policy. We talk with state leaders, and what we create is an interactive table trying to create the policy landscape across the country on one particular issue. And so we've done that recently in governance, financial aid, school discipline, and most recently on K-12 finance. In terms of accessing that document and checking out that table, you can do that through the links that Joel said that we provided on our resource page. And so I just want to highlight, for the K-12 finance one, we really tried to cover some of the biggest issues that you all are grappling with when you're looking at your formulas. And this includes that primary funding model that states have taken, and I will go into that in a little bit more detail in a second. The base amount of funding, how states are counting students for funding purposes. This is an issue that has gained attention since COVID-19, when enrollment has fluctuated quite a bit. Special education funding, funding for English language learners, as has been discussed here, funding to support students from low-income backgrounds, gifted and talented funding, and small or isolated district funding adjustments. We also have state profiles. So if there's just one state you want to look at, you can just pull that up and check that out as well. So on the primary funding model, just to share some of our high-level findings and talk about how you can engage with it. We have classified 49 states and DC into one of 4 funding models. And I say 49 states because we're waiting on North Carolina to adopt their 2021-2023 budget, so we can add them in there. But you'll see for 49 states and DC, we've put them into 4 different funding models. And the 2 most popular models are a student-based foundation or resource-based allocation. And this might seem a little bit like School Finance 101, but I do want to just point to the difference between these 2 models. In a nutshell, the difference is, for one, the student-based option is it's creating a baseline level of spending per student. And then the other option, the resource-based allocation, is guaranteeing a baseline level of resources. So dollars per student in one option, resources in the other. So the student-based foundation is the most popular model. 33 states and DC use it. One of the reasons being that it's fairly easy to adjust funding amounts based upon student or geographic differences. These are called weights, as this task force is familiar, and to provide districts with greater autonomy in decision-making, because the state isn't necessarily mandating what those resources are spent on. A challenge with this model is if that foundation amount is too
Christopher?
low. Yep.
Christopher, I think we have a question from someone. So Representative Kornheiser?
Thanks. And I have not had a chance to peruse your glossary, but I am actually excited about it. As you're going forward, I'd appreciate it if when you use the word weights, you're explicit about how the word weight means different things in the different contexts you're talking about. And I'm sorry I didn't ask you that before you arrived here today.
Yeah, and thank you. And I was going to get into, typically a weight is used in the student-based foundation model, and it is implemented one way, whereas Vermont, you have a very unique funding structure, and I'm also going to get into that in a second. And so those weights are implemented in a slightly different way. And I will kind of go through that in a bit, if that's okay. I don't have a separate term for those, as typically they're just called student weights or pupil weights.
That's okay. You can carry on with what you're doing.
Okay.
Just, I think it's important to explain the different mechanism for how they're used. And it sounds like you were going to do that anyway. So go ahead.
Great, I will. And so I wanted to note that, I set up that there's these two models, a student-based and resource-based approach. And that in Vermont, well, back in the 90s, you had a student-based foundation. You have shifted away from that model. And so we have not classified you as a student-based foundation or a resource-based allocation, because as you are all aware, your system is set up so that your local school boards are creating the budgets and then it's approved by voters. So it is not a system where there's a state guarantee for a spending level or a resource level. And so we have classified you all as a guaranteed tax base, because your system does ensure that communities spending the same per equalized student will have the same homestead tax rate, regardless of that local wealth in that area. Well, Wisconsin's the only other state that we've classified as a guaranteed tax base, because they have a similar emphasis on taxpayer equity. But I do recognize that your system and Wisconsin's are very different. And it was really just that similarity around focus around taxpayer equity that we put you together. And so some of the ways that you can engage with this high level summary of information is if you are trying to reevaluate how you are allocating funds in your primary funding formula. Like, for instance, Tennessee currently they have a resource-based approach. They've decided they want to go to a student-based approach. And so they have, are looking at models around designing their student-based approach. They could, for instance, go in and see what states have that model, what states in the region have that model with similar size, with similar demographics, and use this as a way of either reaching out to those states directly or reaching out to us, and we can help you kind of work through and think through ways of designing it. So I was going to take a pause right here before I shift gears, and I was going to talk about English learner funding, because that's been an area of interest and discussion. But I did want to stop briefly to see if there were any other questions about this resource or any of the primary funding terms that I've just used and laid out.
Representative Kornheiser?
Thanks. Can you explain one more time the difference between student-based foundation and a resource-based allocation?
Yes, I can. Sorry, I lost my cursor with the mute here. So I think it's helpful to think of it in terms of state examples. So a state that has a student-based foundation will set out either in statute or in their budget a foundation amount that is guaranteed per student. And the way that funding amount is split between the state and the local school districts will vary, but there will be a defined dollar or foundation amount that is said is necessary to meet the educational standards for that state. And you can, we collected those base funding amounts in our 50 state comparison as well. In contrast, a resource-based allocation model those states typically will have staffing standards in statute. And they will use those staffing standards along as estimates for other costs of education, whether that's supplies, transportation, to generate an estimated cost that needs to be provided for their students. But the driving force behind their formula are the staffing standards that they've set out. So you could look at Tennessee's basic education program or Virginia's standards of quality as two examples of states that have those staffing standards.
Are there other questions at the moment about the differences? And did you all see the maps and the map that Vermont is on? Okay. There are no questions. You can carry on, Christopher. Thank you.
Great. I'm sorry if I'm going a little fast here. I know you've been here for so long today that I'm just trying to get my 2 cents in before you.
Oh, no, you're doing fine.
So the other, another item that we identify is funding for English learners. And I know this task force has been discussing this in depth. And so what we collect information on is whether that the state has a funding stream for designated for English learners, and 47 states and DC do. Montana and Mississippi do not. We also identify the mechanism that they've set up for using the program name, the funding amount, and then the relevant state statute or budget, so that you all can look in and find that. Or so as has been discussed, Vermont is one of the 21 states in DC that currently uses a flat weight, and your weight, additional 0.2 or an additional 20%. There's wide variation in states that have weights ranging from less than 10% in Kentucky to 100%, which is double the funding in Maryland. Obviously, the weight is just one part of this. There's also the foundation amount that it's being applied to for states that have a student-based foundation, which, Vermont is a unique circumstance. But I just wanted, if you're just looking at those weights, I do think it's important that you take into consideration that the foundation amount is just as important as the weight itself. But states have other approaches. 11 states have multiple weights where that amount the weight amount varies based upon English proficiency. This is a method to try to direct additional resources for students that may need additional services and less resources to students that need less services. In addition to that, 5 states have a resource-based approach, which means that they are allocating positions, either English learner instructors or support positions, to assist with English learner students. And 5 states solely use categorical grants. And that has been an interest here for this task force, those 5 states being Alabama, Delaware, Idaho, Indiana, and West Virginia. In addition, 2 states have a hybrid approach where they have a categorical grant and a weight within their funding system, and that is Connecticut and Colorado. And so if as you're designing your categorical program, and it looks like you're pretty far along in the modeling, these are potential states when it comes to the implementation of those programs that you could potentially look to see if they have ideas that might facilitate in you implementing that here in Vermont. I also quickly looked at the states that have a fairly low percentage of EL students in the state, since Vermont is one of the lower in the country at just over 2% is what I saw from NCES. And so those other states, Montana does not have EL funding. West Virginia uses a categorical grant, but those are those are subject to appropriations, and districts have to apply for those funds. I think that type of model would be problematic and would really kind of get to some of the concerns that were raised in public comment about uncertainty if it was on an application basis. New Hampshire uses a flat weight, which is actually just a dollar amount of $725.63, very precise per EL student. And Wyoming uses a resource-based system with one teacher and one support position for every 100 students. So really runs the gamut for states with lower EL populations in them.
Christopher, hold on just one second. Could you just repeat the dollar amount that New Hampshire uses?
Yes, it is $725.63 per EL student, and that is for the 2022. Let me want to check here to make sure I have the year correct.
$725.63. A little bit different than the 5,000 that we.
Well, for next year, it's 740.87.
Does it go up by inflation? Is it tied to some kind of index?
I actually do not know. I think that that it might just be appropriated and they have, but maybe there's I would have to check on that actually.
We like to compare ourselves to New Hampshire and just show how much better we are. So that's why we're asking. Yeah. So go ahead.
So now I wanted to get into that question that came up about how a weight functions differently in a state with a student-based foundation and a state in Vermont where it's a guaranteed tax-based system. And so in a student-based foundation, which is the most frequent state model that uses weights, that pupil weight, it's pretty straightforward, is an additional amount of funding that is going to support services for EL students. So if a state requires $10,000 per student and they have a weight of additional 20%, then you're seeing $12,000 per student for an EL student. Alternatively, some states will apply that weight to the enrollment count rather than the foundation amount, but mathematically it's the same. There's additional aid going to districts with EL students. In a guaranteed tax-based system, like structured like Vermont's, I don't know if there's necessarily one model of a guaranteed tax-based system, but anyway, that's beside the point. In more of your model, that funding amount that is going to support schools is determined by referendum and local voters. So the equalized pupil count does not increase the size of the adopted budget. Instead, the equalized pupil count influences the other side of the equation, which is who is paying for it. So the pupil count factors into the property tax rates and the ed fund and how much resources they receive. So the larger the equalized pupil unit, the lower the tax burden on districts with more EL students and potentially more funds from the ed fund. And so while this encourages increased spending, it does not necessarily guarantee additional resources for EL students. And so I think that is just something I wanted to point out as a difference. And so you can look to categorical programs to direct additional funds for EL services. However, and you all just had a pretty lengthy discussion on this, you'd want to make sure that if you do that, that it's funded at an adequate level and to achieve the desired outcomes. And so that's where it's great that you are continuing conversations with Dr. Colby, but I just wanted to make that note. Another option, not to throw a wrench into any plans that are pretty far along, but you could also consider a hybrid approach like Colorado, Connecticut, where they have both a weight in their formula and a categorical aid program. So I wanted to stop here, and that is most of the ground I wanted to cover. So I didn't want to take up too much of your time, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you all have.
Does anyone have any other questions for Christopher? There are also other parts of the report that we asked him to go into the ELL portion of it because that was an issue that we were considering, but there are other weights or other ways of funding different things if we have questions about those as well. Senator Perchlik.
Thank you. Christopher, do you have a table that actually shows the dollar amount for all the states? Like, have you done the math? Because often it on the table, it'll give us like the total categorical grant for the whole state or the weight. Has anybody gone through and figured out what that in any one year has meant and on a dollar per student basis?
So I don't think that, and this is why we do this, is a lot of the the 50 state comparisons that are out there are looking just at the outputs, how much total funds are going out of the system, not going through and looking at each individual component of the formula. And so we are happy to go and find the enrollment counts for those states and come up with a dollar amount for the categorical programs. We don't have that in the table right now. But if that's of interest to you and members of the task force, happy to pull that information.
Yeah.
And Senator, would that be for all 50 states or just the states that have? I think it would be interesting to see the states that have the categorical aid, but also the states that have a foundation formula weight, because you can much more easily figure out a dollar amount for a foundation formula weight than you can on our kind of system because of the range issues that we were just talking about. Could you back into the amounts for the foundation formula if they're not already tied to a dollar amount?
I think for some states that might be easier than others. So I don't want to make promises on all 50, but certainly we'll do our best to get you as many states as we can. For the categorical aid ones, it will be easier. But for some of the other ones, it will be more challenging. There's also, and this is something that has been a personal area interest for mine for looking at low-income student funding and trying to compare across is there's just a lot of differences between the way the state structure the program. So just coming up with a dollar comparison can be a real time-consuming process based upon how they determine who is eligible and if they have a range and all of these other issues. So I do want to just throw that cautionary note out there, but happy to do my best to get you as many states as we can.
That would be great. Without obviously, we know you're limited and we're one of 50 states and we are such a tiny state, but whatever you can do to give us something to compare to would be helpful. Thank you. Senator Perchlik, go ahead.
To follow up on that, because it's interesting that some of them are just like a couple $100s. Then Maryland, I'm assuming, is going to be in the thousands of dollars because that's a full 100% of their foundation grant. So even if it's just a range, it doesn't have to be all of them, but it would be interesting where we line up if there's a range of multiple states.
Are there other questions for Christopher? At this point, Representative James, you're good. I saw you start to raise your hand, so I wanted to make sure.
I'll let you know.
Okay, all right. Is there anything else you wanted to add while we have you here?
Well, thank you for having me here. And I also, as Joel noted in the intro, we do work in more than just school finance. We cover over 60 issue areas. So if there's another topic area that is important where a cross-state comparison or cross-state learnings would be useful, just please think of us.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today and for updating this report. There's a lot in here, a lot of links that I just encourage everybody to look at. And just a note that I was talking to Representative Kornheiser, I did look at this report, your previous version of the report, when I was Deb Brighton and I were trying to figure out the amount for the ELL. So it's really helpful to have this 50 states comparison. So thank you so much for your work and for being here with us today. And have a good weekend.
Yes, thank you, Senator and members of the task force. Have a wonderful weekend.
Take care. All right. Oh, yes.
I wanted to make a tiny clarifying announcement to folks because I've been getting some emails from other members, not task force members, about this. And I'm sure everyone knows this, but nothing we're going to do on this task force or in the legislation is going to impact FY23 budgets because those are going to be voted on before we even recess this year. And that gets confusing because calendar years and FYs are different from each other and all of those things. But nothing we do is going to impact FY23 budgets, which are being developed right now and will be voted on before this probably moves from one body to the other body. Yeah. Great. Thank you for that public service.
I also just saw in my email, I haven't looked at it the whole time because I've been trying to focus on the meeting. But apparently the audio wasn't working at the beginning this morning when I so carefully read that statement so that everybody would know. So if there are people who need to send it out to people who ask you, please just forward that email. I will forward it to the people I heard from. They're not reading again, so.
The transcription was working and it came in partway through.
75% of it was correct or something like that. Is that?
Is it up on the website too?
Oh, could we post it on the website? Could you make it a document and post it on the website? Yeah, sorry, everybody out there in YouTube land. I was trying to be as clear as possible, and then we've had tech issues kind of all day on and off. So we don't have anybody waiting okay. Good. We are on track. We're scheduled to meet next Wednesday again. Emily and I will be checking in with our team over here and to see how possible it is to actually have some data to look at. It's obviously a really short amount of time. There is a meeting that you have scheduled, right, Mark, with Professor Colby on Monday. Okay, and that will go through the recalculation of the weights and also some other clarifying questions we had from her. We have a memo that we'll send to you over the weekend that we just received. Emily and I would like to look at it first, and then we'll send it to the committee. And so you have everything that we have, and we'll keep you in the loop. Please check your emails and your texts and your phone to make sure. If we have to reschedule or cancel at the last minute, we'll let you know, and apologies in advance, but obviously this is complicated. So is there anything else before anyone else wants to ask or say? Yeah.
Yeah, I had a couple things I wanted to either ask or say. So I will ask as I say.
Go for it.
One of the things that I'm hoping we have time to do is maybe have Deb come in or see something in writing about how exactly the ELL grant amounts were derived. We've talked about it sort of in passing, but to my mind, we haven't directly, for me anyway, we haven't directly talked about that enough. And I really would like to have a little bit more background on how those numbers were calculated, and specifically how they are linked to or based in the study. And then the second thing is, I guess, just for my own peace of mind, I wanted to make sure, or at least say that I hope that some of the milestones that we've passed are things that we're still able to go back and discuss, or at least analyze, because there's still some things that I'm not 100% comfortable with. I still am waking up in the middle of the night a little bit about district versus school and the choice between those models. And I just want to make sure that we're not proceeding so far down the road that we can't go back and talk about those things, that there's not going to be a point at which it's too late.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what we said when we made those preliminary decisions is that they were preliminary and we wanted to model them so we could see the impact of them. And the modeling is taking longer than we had hoped, but once we have it, we can sort of reassess, does it do what we thought it was going to do? And we can certainly get a write-up on the ELL. And that actually reminded me of another issue. We are, obviously things have we're not on schedule to where we had hoped to be at this point, but we do still have to have a written report, have an explanation of all the things we've decided that is due on December 15th to various committees. And that is also supposed to include a bill draft. So we want to have everybody involved in writing the report. So
A little.
at least a little bit. So that Emily and I are talking about assigning sections for each of you to write like paragraphs, like 1 or 2 paragraphs, not like pages and pages, so that we fully explain why we did or didn't do some things. There are some things that we're not doing anything about, and we wanted an explanation of why. And a good example, Representative James, is we're not coming up with a a categorical aid grant or any kind of funding for trauma-based or ACEs-based costs in schools. And that was something that we had preliminarily decided to ask the education committees to look at. And so we were considering having you write that paragraph because it's an area that you know about. And Senator Perchlik, having you write a paragraph about school construction and the sort of status and how that relates to our work, but that we're not actually doing something about school construction directly in this. So those are examples, and we have areas for each of you, and that we'll let you know after we finalize to make sure we've caught everything. And then you work with one of us to write that or send it to one of us to write it. Does that sound okay? It won't be a
does.
lot.
Yeah, it was just important to me to clarify. I understand the complexity of this work and how much time it takes, and that we also have a deadline. I just want to make sure that we're not gliding past a point of no return on decisions that I remember us all saying like, yes, let's take a look at that. I want to make sure that there's not suddenly morphing into like set in stone and oops, too late, we can't go back.
Right.
And so
Absolutely. And nothing's set in stone, even if we make what we consider a final decision, because it goes to the legislature as a whole.
great. Well, that'll help me sleep at night, and happy to hear about the report. I think it's so critical that the report we write be easy to understand. Can't even emphasize that enough, and happy to help with that.
Excellent. Thank you. Oh, was there a question over here? Andy?
And one of the things that came up today on the public hearing, and I've been getting some email from constituents about, is the Special Education Funding Act 173 or 73?
173.
173. And which happened before my time here at the legislature, but I didn't, we're not planning, that would be another thing that we're not planning on addressing. I know that, but I wondered if, I guess it's just something for the education committees to look at again, but.
Yeah, so what we had, the report does talk about special education funding, and there is an interaction potentially with special education funding.
Right.
And the report has two options, which we preliminarily decided to go with one of them, which was to not change Act 173 at this point and have it be implemented and at least go through full implementation
Right.
before we start trying to change it.
Right.
That we thought that it was too early to change something that hasn't even gone into effect yet.
Right.
Um,
It goes into effect next year. It's been
I
delayed
think
a
the
couple
first
times.
year of it is next year, right, Brad?
July
July 1st,
2022.
FY '23, yeah, so,
Assuming no delay.
right, we've delayed it twice.
Right, yeah.
One because of issues with professional development, and the second time because of COVID. So hopefully it will go through, and then we can see what the impact is, or future legislatures can see what the impact is and decide if they want to change it. But I do think we could put that into our evaluation and say, we want to make sure we evaluate it together to see if it's working or if it needs to be modified.
That'd be good.
Yeah.
Following up on that, so in the report, it sort of offers these two options of changing 173's implementation, and says if we're not doing that, there's a set of weights that are preferable because they account for some of the increased special education costs for kids in poverty. And that's that particular weight, which is labeled, I'm really hoping I get this right. I'm not looking over there purposely.
Without.
Is labeled without controls for special education, which I think feels counterintuitive for us sometimes, but that means that it accounts for the costs. It doesn't control for it, so it accounts for it. And so that's that's like the set of weights that's being modeled. One of the reasons I made that FY '23 announcement was particularly about Act 173 implementation and people's concerns about the interaction between the weights and 173 implementation. Because I'm also getting emails.
Did you get that right, Brad? But this has been a robust back and forth between all of us about what it does it mean and which ones to use. Are there other questions or comments or concerns you're hearing about Emily and I will try to reply to all of those emails that we've all been getting. There's just, it's been a rough week. So, anything else? Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone, for your work today, and we'll hope to see you next Wednesday. And thank you so